The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer as Ashley Cooper pushed through the employee entrance at Seattle General, her badge catching the pale glow like a shield she didn't believe in anymore. 5:11 a.m. The parking lot had still been dark, the kind of dark that reminds you what silence sounds like. Her scrubs were navy blue, unremarkable, the same color worn by 100 other nurses rotating through the halls of this Savannah hospital where competence went unnoticed and exhaustion was the only universal language anyone spoke. She moved through the corridors with the economical precision of someone who had memorized every exit, every supply closet, every angle of sight. Muscle memory from another life. Her hands moved to check the supply cart in the veterans' wing, gauze, saline, pressure dressings arranged with tactical awareness rather than nursing protocol. The difference would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't stood in a field hospital with mortar rounds walking closer, had to know without thinking where everything was because thinking got people killed. Room 4B was the third door on the left. She'd been there at 4:12 a.m. yesterday morning and the morning before that. The patient in the wheelchair faced the window, though his eyes never tracked movement outside. Traumatic brain injury from an IED blast in 2011, that's what the chart said. That's what the charts always said when they wanted to sum up a person's destruction in medical shorthand. His left arm bore a faded tattoo, the ink degraded by time and sun exposure, Cooper, the letters wavering slightly beneath crossed rifles. The image was small, maybe 3 inches tall, positioned on the inside of his wrist where most people wouldn't see it unless they were looking for it. Unless they were someone who had earned the right to be remembered that way. Ashley adjusted his blanket without speaking. The fabric was synthetic, cheap, the kind that never quite held warmth the way cotton did. She'd learned the difference between fabrics in triage tents. She'd learned the difference between a lot of things that most nurses never had to know. The veteran's head remained still. His breathing was even, the oxygen saturation reading on his monitor steady at 94%. Good vitals. Strong heart. The brain, though, the brain was somewhere else, floating in a fog that no medication could clear, no therapy could penetrate. He stared at nothing with the blank intensity of someone who had looked at something so terrible that his mind had simply decided to stop processing the world as it was. She checked the fall line. Looked good. The catheter site showed no redness, no swelling, no signs of infection. Everything documented, everything pristine, everything the way it was supposed to be. She didn't touch his arm, didn't trace the letters beneath his tattoo, didn't let her hand shake the way it wanted to when she read her own name written in ink that had been applied in a desert 6,000 miles from here, 6,000 miles from this moment, 6,000 years ago by the measure of how a person ages under fire. That's the one with the bleeding heart, nurse, isn't it? The voice came from the doorway. Not loud, but the kind of quiet that carries weight when the person speaking it knows exactly what they're doing. Dr. Marcus Mercer stood in the frame of the door like he'd been positioned there by a photographer who specialized in portraits of arrogance. 53 years old, according to the hospital directory. Yale Medical School, Stanford residency, orthopedic surgeon with a 7-figure salary and a reputation for being right about things, which meant everyone else was wrong most of the time. He wore his white coat over a tailored shirt that cost more than Ashley's monthly car payment. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror finish that you could see your own smallness in. "Good morning, Doctor," Ashley said. Her voice came out even, professional, the tone she'd perfected over 8 years of nursing rotations and 4 years before that of something she couldn't talk about. "His vitals are stable. No changes since the night shift." Mercer stepped into the room without being invited. He didn't look at the patient. He looked at Ashley the way a surgeon looks at a suture he didn't place, something that needed correcting. "The full line is clean, I assume. Changed at 0400 hours. No complications." "Hours." He repeated the word as if she'd just pronounced something in a language he found distasteful. "You speak like you're still in the military or something." He smiled without warmth. The smile was the kind that shows you all of someone's teeth at once. Most nurses just say "for in the morning." Ashley's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, so brief that if Mercer had blinked he would have missed it. But he wasn't blinking. He was watching her the way a predator watches prey that doesn't yet know it's been marked. I'll note that for next time, doctor. See that you do. He moved closer to the patient, examining him with the focused intensity of someone assessing a medical puzzle. The veteran's eyes didn't track Mercer's movements. They stayed fixed on the window, on whatever internal landscape his shattered brain had retreated to. Mercer's expression didn't change. He might have been looking at a mannequin. Car accident victim. IED exposure. Military service connected. Ah. The sound was small, dismissive, the way someone says "I see you" when they've stopped listening halfway through your sentence. Another vet. We seem to get an unusual number of them through here. You know what that is, Nurse Cooper. He knew her name. She'd never told him her name. She always wore her badge, but most doctors didn't read nurse badges. They didn't need to. But Mercer had read it. Mercer was the kind of doctor who read things carefully so he could use them later. What's that, doctor? Soft hearts. He turned to face her, blocking the window so the patient's light dimmed. The hospital administration gets donations from veterans organizations. They get good press. So they overstock the veterans wing with nurses who think a little hand-holding and compassion can substitute for proper medical training. It's honestly quite inefficient. He paused. Let the silence settle like sediment. You must struggle sometimes, knowing the limits of what a nursing degree can teach you. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical humming. Somewhere in the distance, an elevator chimed. A code blue announcement drifted through the intercom from another floor, another crisis, another emergency that didn't involve Dr. Mercer having to actually help anyone. Ashley's hands remained steady. Her breathing remained even. She had been threatened by people with actual weapons, actual authority backed by actual consequences. She recognized the posture of someone trying to establish dominance through social pressure. She had learned, a long time ago, not to flinch when predators showed their teeth. I do my job, doctor. The patients recover or they don't. That's what matters. Does it? Mercer smiled again. Walked toward the door. Paused on the threshold as if something had just occurred to him. I'm presenting rounds at 10. Grand rounds, the surgical residents attend. I'm going to use a case study about overstep. About nurses who exceed their training and think they're physicians. I might reference this ward as an example of the problem. He looked back at her one final time. You should be in the audience. Might be educational. He left before she could respond. His shoes clicked against the tile floor, expensive leather on linoleum, a sound like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Ashley turned back to the patient in the wheelchair. His eyes still hadn't moved. His breathing was still steady. He had no idea who she was and she couldn't tell him. She finished her rounds an hour later. The other 3 patients in the veterans wing didn't require much attention, stable vitals, manageable pain, the routine of post-recovery care that most people thought was easy because they'd never had to do it. It was easy if you didn't see the faces behind the charts. It was easy if you didn't know the sound that a person makes when they come back from the edge. Ashley had heard that sound before. She carried it like scar tissue that never quite healed. At 7:22 p.m., she unlocked her apartment on Forsythia Street and found her daughter sitting on the sofa with her backpack beside her, homework spread across the coffee table in organized chaos. Emma was 8 years old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's hands, long fingers, the kind that could do precise work if the world ever asked them to. She looked up when the door opened, and something in her face shifted from concentrating to relieved. Hi, Mommy. Hi, baby. Ashley set her work bag on the shelf beside the kitchen and knelt down to Emma's level. Her scrub smelled like antiseptic and something else, the faint metallic undertone of clinical environments, places where people got fixed or didn't. How was school? Good. Mrs. Patterson said my essay on Harriet Tubman was really good. She put a star on it. Emma held up the paper, proud and small, the way children are when they've accomplished something they weren't sure about. Did you have a good day at work? Ashley pulled her daughter into an embrace, breathing in the scent of her hair, apple shampoo from the drugstore, something innocent and permanent and hers. I did. Long day, but good. Was there an emergency? No emergencies today. Good. Emma settled back into her homework, and Ashley moved to the kitchen to start dinner. Chicken and rice, nothing complicated, nothing that required the kind of precision she'd once used to save lives on the fly. The kitchen was small, the apartment was small, everything in her civilian life was small and contained and safe in a way that made her feel like she was suffocating sometimes. She didn't know that in 7 hours, the entire equilibrium of her existence would crack. She didn't know that Dr. Mercer was already on the phone with the hospital's chief medical officer, already establishing his narrative, already preparing the stage for what happened next. She didn't know that the veteran in room for B would code in 52 hours, and that she would have to choose between her daughter's future and his life. She didn't know any of that yet. She just made dinner and listened to her daughter talk about school and tried not to think about the faded tattoo on a man's wrist, or about a war that officially didn't happen to a woman who officially didn't exist. The Grand Rounds amphitheater smelled like antiseptic and ambition. 50 medical students sat in ascending rows, notepads ready, pens poised, waiting to absorb wisdom from the surgical department's golden child. Dr. Mercer stood at the podium with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned, his voice resonating through the space like a tank idling in a garage. This is what happens when nursing staff confuses compassion with competence, he began, clicking to the first slide. Ashley's face appeared on the projection screen, her employee badge photo, neutral expression, professional. The amphitheater fell silent. Ms. Cooper here has been overstepping with our indigent veteran population, apparently believing that empathy substitutes for actual medical training. Ashley sat in the back row, hands folded in her lap. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She watched the slide advance to her patient notes, her interventions, her assessments, all accurate, all within scope, all presented with his interpretive twist that made kindness sound like recklessness. Textbook example of exceeding scope of practice, Mercer continued, pacing like a lawyer before a jury. A nurse does not diagnose. A nurse does not interpret diagnostic imaging. A nurse certainly does not make treatment decisions that belong in physician hands. He paused, letting that land. We will be implementing new protocols to prevent this kind of boundary violation. 50 faces turned toward her. The weight of their attention felt like pressure on her chest. Ashley kept her eyes steady on the presentation screen, watched him perform for his audience, and took one measured breath. Just one. That was all the humanity she allowed herself. The rest was composure, the same composure that had kept her alive when helicopter rotors shook the dust from Iraqi rooftops, the same composure that had held her steady when a colleague bled out in her arms and she had to keep moving, keep working, keep saving the ones who remained. Mercer finished a thoughtful nodding from the residents. He'd built a narrative. He'd made her sound dangerous. The vending machine in the break room hummed its mechanical rhythm when she arrived that afternoon, needing coffee the way some people needed oxygen. Her hand was steady as she fed bills into the slot, selected dark roast, watched it drop. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in a sickly pale glow, and the hallway beyond the break room was empty except for the sound of footsteps and voices turning the corner. She recognized Mercer's cadence immediately, the confident, measured tone he used with people he wanted to impress. He was talking to 3 surgical residents, their voices lower but eager. She didn't move. Her hand stilled on the coffee cup. Nurses like her, bleeding hearts who probably couldn't get into real medical school, are exactly why Seattle General needs stricter protocols, Mercer was saying, his words carrying the weight of pronouncement. I've already spoken to administration about restricting her access to certain floors. These people think caring is enough. They don't understand hierarchy. They don't understand that medicine is a precise science, not a feelings competition. One resident laughed, a sound like permission being granted for something cruel. Ashley's fingers tightened on the paper cup. She could feel her heartbeat in her temples, could feel the old discipline rising up to meet the moment, could feel the part of her that had been trained to compartmentalize pain, to file it away, to move forward. A single tear escaped her left eye. Just one. She wiped it without looking away from the vending machine glass, watching her own reflection, a woman who was supposed to be dead, a woman who wasn't supposed to exist, a woman whose hands had held lives together in places the world would never acknowledge. The voices faded as Mercer and the residents moved past the break room door. That afternoon, when the patient from 4B began coding during her shift, everything narrowed to signal and response. VFib. The monitor screaming its aluminum bright distress call. The attending physician frozen for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Ashley to understand that this man, whoever he was, had maybe 90 seconds before irreversible damage set in. She moved with precision. Her hands knew exactly where to place the defibrillation pads, knew the exact angle, knew that electricity and timing and certainty were the only language that mattered now. The attending blinked twice, once in surprise, once in recognition of competence. She charged to 200 joules, called clear, and the patient's body arced on the stretcher as the electricity found its purpose. Sinus rhythm. The monitor found its steady pulse. She was checking the fall line, confirming placement, her breathing controlled and even, when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway. His face darkened the way summer sky darkens before a storm. For a moment, neither of them moved. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The monitors beeped their digital confirmation that the patient was alive, that the intervention had worked, that the outcome was salvage instead of tragedy. Nurse Cooper, you just practice medicine without a license. His voice carried the temperature of winter concrete. Security will be escorting you out if this happens again. Am I clear? She turned to him slowly. The patient's hand lay on the stretcher rail, fingers slightly curled. The attending physician stood frozen, caught between professional courtesy and the reality of what he'd just witnessed, a nurse performing at a level that made his hesitation look like incompetence. Ashley wiped one more tear without breaking eye contact, and when she spoke, her voice dropped an octave. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere trained, somewhere that had made battlefield decisions at 24 years old. I practice saving lives, doctor. You should try it sometime. The ICU fell silent. The patient stared at her with eyes that held no recognition, no memory, just the blank gaze of traumatic brain injury. His brain had been damaged so severely that the woman standing before him, the woman who'd carried him 3 miles through the streets of Tikrit under enemy fire, her uniform soaked with dust and his blood, meant nothing to him now. He didn't know her name. He didn't know that her faded unit patch, sewn inside her jacket lining in the locker 3 floors below, bore the same insignia as the tattoo on his wrist. He didn't know that the reason she'd moved with such precision was muscle memory from a war that officially never happened, from a special forces medic whose service records had been erased by Pentagon order, from a captain who was supposed to be dead. Dr. Mercer's jaw tightened. His eyes held hers for exactly 2 seconds, and in that space, something shifted. She'd crossed a line. She'd spoken truth to power in front of witnesses. She'd implied, by defending her actions, that she knew something about medicine that he couldn't control or dismiss. That was the moment he decided to destroy her. Over the next week, Ashley noticed the small changes, the kind of cuts that didn't bleed immediately but left scars. Her badge no longer opened the ICU doors after 6 in the evening. The night supervisor delivered the news with eyes that couldn't meet hers, system update, nothing personal. Her schedule changed. She was moved from the Veterans Wing to General Med-Surg rotation, shift patterns designed to prevent any overlap with Mercer's rounds. She found a memo restricting her access to certain medication cards, requiring attending physician co-signature for procedures she'd performed independently for 7 years. Nothing dramatic. Nothing dramatic was precisely the point. Rumors moved through the hospital like water through sand. She overheard 2 nurses in the break room, their voices falling silent when she entered, one of them mentioning casually, Mercer said she's been written up 3 times. A lie? 3 written evaluations in a decade versus his fictional 3 times narrative, but the rumor had already taken shape. Facts became less important than narrative. The narrative that Mercer was constructing, piece by careful piece, with the phone calls he made to board members and the emails he sent to administration. At the nurse's station one evening, she heard him on his cell phone, his voice pitched for confidentiality but loud enough to carry, "Yes, board member Richardson, I appreciate your mentorship. There's a staffing matter I'd like your perspective on." His eyes found hers across the floor as he said it, a deliberate acknowledgement that he was talking about her, that he was building alliances, that her professional isolation was strategic and intentional. That evening, Ashley sat across from her 8-year-old daughter at their kitchen table, watching Emma push spaghetti around her plate in lazy circles. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that smelled like tomato sauce and the faint ghost of antiseptic that seemed to follow her home no matter how many times she showered. "Mom, why do you come home sad now?" Emma asked, her voice small and precise, the way children's observations always were, cutting through everything to the truth underneath. Ashley forced a smile. It probably looked like pain. "Just a long shift, baby. Nothing to worry about. Are you in trouble at work?" The question hit like a defibrillator to her chest. This child had never asked her about work before. This meant the sadness was showing through the composure, meant Emma was old enough to read her mother's grief like a book written in a language they shared. "No trouble," Ashley said. "Just some changes coming. Some new people who want things done differently." She couldn't tell Emma the truth. She couldn't explain that speaking her name, Captain Ashley Cooper, 3 tours, Special Forces medic, Silver Star, would violate a Pentagon agreement that had cost her everything. The operation in Tikrit. The wounded left behind. The impossible choice she'd made to save 32 lives by sacrificing her own future. When the Pentagon buried that operation, they didn't just classify it. They made it so that if she ever surfaced, if she ever claimed that service, it would endanger every soldier who'd been with her, every person who'd participated in what was now officially a mission that never happened. So she sat at the kitchen table with her daughter and let Dr. Mercer dismantle her career piece by calculated piece, unable to defend herself with the only truth that would have saved her, the truth she could never tell. The apartment was quiet except for Emma's soft breathing as she ate. Outside, rain had begun to hammer the windows like applause for something Ashley didn't deserve. The apartment was quiet except for Emma's soft breathing as she ate. Outside, rain had begun to hammer the windows like applause for something Ashley didn't deserve. She sat across from her daughter, watching the 8-year-old push carrots around her plate, and realized she'd stopped asking about school 3 days ago. 3 days since Mercer had started making calls. The next morning, Ashley swiped her badge at the ICU entrance at 5:51 a.m. The light turned red. She tried again. Red again. The night supervisor, Janet, someone Ashley had helped through a difficult cesarean 6 months ago, appeared at the security window and wouldn't quite make eye contact. "System update," Janet said, adjusting her computer screen. "You'll need to request manual access from the nursing director." The nursing director didn't answer emails. When Ashley finally tracked her down in the hallway on Thursday, the woman's phone buzzed mid-conversation, and she glanced at the screen, made an apologetic gesture, and disappeared around the corner. No explanation. Just a smile that didn't reach her eyes and the faint smell of expensive perfume lingering after she left. That same Thursday, Ashley realized the schedule had changed. The 3 nurses who'd been present when she'd stabilized the coding patient, Marcus, Jennifer, and David, were gone from the day rotation. Night shift. All 3 of them. When she asked Marcus in the break room, his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Mercer requested it, he said, not meeting her gaze. Administrative decision. Said something about staffing needs and optimal resource allocation. Nobody wanted to push back. His hands trembled slightly around his coffee cup. Fear looked the same on everyone. The official incident reports arrived in her mailbox on Friday afternoon. 5 pages of densely typed accusations. Overstepping scope of practice. Unsupervised surgical intervention. Performing procedures outside her training and authorization. The language was precise, clinical, devastating. It read like a script written by someone who understood how institutions worked, how bureaucracies protected themselves, how a single file could become a liability that had to be managed. Copies had been distributed to the nursing director, to hospital administration, to the chief medical officer. Each one stamped with the date and Mercer's signature, that careful, arrogant signature she'd seen on a dozen medication orders and patient notes. But it was the new protocol that crystallized everything. Posted on Monday morning in the staff break room, printed on official hospital letterhead. All veteran patient care would require Dr. Mercer's prior written approval. No exceptions. Any nurse proceeding without authorization would face immediate disciplinary review. Ashley read it twice, standing alone by the coffee maker that smelled like burnt beans and stale almonds. He'd constructed a cage so methodical, so perfectly legal, that there was no way to fight back without admitting what she'd done. Without revealing why she could do it. She was still holding the protocol sheet when the power died. 3 weeks into his campaign, the transformer explosion came without warning. The sound arrived first, a crack like the sky splitting open, followed by a boom that shook the entire building. Ashley was restocking for supplies on the 4th floor when the fluorescent lights died mid-flicker, plunging the corridor into absolute darkness. For 2 seconds, nothing moved. Then the alarms began, a shrieking chorus of monitors, ventilators, and backup systems screaming into the void. The emergency generators kicked in. The lights sputtered back, dimmer now, running on battery reserve. Red emergency lights painted everything the color of old blood. Generator failure in wings C and D, the intercom crackled, a voice tight with controlled panic. All critical patients to stabilized units. Immediate priority evacuation protocol. But the veteran was in wing D. Ashley moved. Not rushed, movement without panic traveled faster than panic. She made it to the ICU in 20 seconds, muscle memory carrying her through hallways she'd walked 100 times. Monitors were dark. Patients were being disconnected from ventilators, moved to beds that could be manually pumped. A young resident was panicking, trying to remember which direction was downstairs. Then she heard the sound. Not a crash, worse than that. A wet tearing, like fabric splitting under pressure. She moved toward it. The veteran lay in Bay 4, his chest wound open to the air. The surgical site where the trauma surgeon had closed him after the initial stabilization was dehiscing, splitting along the suture line as his respiratory rate climbed higher and higher, his body fighting for air it couldn't hold. His breathing was fast and shallow, the color draining from his face in real time. Pneumothorax. The lung was collapsing. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway behind her, his face processing what was happening in real time. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. What are you? Ashley was already moving toward the crash cart, her hand steady as surgical lasers. She grabbed the drawer. The scalpel was there, a number 10 blade, not the right instrument but the only one available. She didn't waste time looking for alternatives. Field thoracotomy, she said. Not a question. Not a request. A statement of fact. You can't, Mercer said. His voice had lost its authority. You're not authorized to. She was already scrubbing with antiseptic from the emergency kit, her hands moving through the ritual without conscious thought. Left second intercostal space, midclavicular line. That was the place. That was always the place. The scalpel cut through skin and muscle like she had done this yesterday instead of 8 years ago. Like her hands remembered things her mind had tried to forget. The precision came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, the kind of muscle memory that lived in bone and nerve, from holding a field hospital together alone in Tikrit when the wounded wouldn't stop coming and there was only her and a morphine drip running dry. The lung was there. Collapsed. Bleeding just enough to matter. She found the bleeding point, clamped it with a Kelly clamp from the crash cart, her movements economical and exact. The collapsed lung reinflated as the pressure equalized. Color crept back into the veteran's face. His breathing deepened, steadied. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. O2 climbing. 72, 78. 84 was stable. For minutes. The entire procedure took for minutes. When the lights flickered back to full brightness, flooding the room with harsh white fluorescence, 3 nurses stood in the hallway staring at her. Their faces held the expression of people watching someone become something they weren't supposed to be. Ashley straightened. Her scrubs were stained with blood. Her hands were still steady. She looked directly at each of them, Marcus, Jennifer, David, and saw something shift in their eyes. Not fear anymore. Recognition. "Call the attending surgeon," she said quietly. Her voice had changed. Lower than it had been. "Not asking. Tell them the patient's thoracotomy is secure and stable pending formal repair. They'll need to assess for additional injuries." It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in rooms where obedience meant the difference between living and dying. Dr. Mercer was still standing in the doorway, his face white, his phone already in his hand. She watched him see her clearly for the first time, not the deferential nurse he'd been constructing a case against, but something else entirely. Something that had walked through combat zones and held people together with nothing but competence and will. "I'm going on break," Ashley said to no one in particular, and walked past him into the corridor. Behind her, she heard him pull up a contact list on his phone. She heard his breath coming faster. She heard the sound of institutional power being mobilized, calls being made, allies being activated, a narrative being desperately reconstructed. What he didn't hear was the sound of her fear. Because in that moment, with a veteran steady breathing as a baseline and 3 witnesses who finally understood what they'd been watching, Ashley Cooper had nothing left to lose. And that was when everything changed. The power was back in 40 minutes. The generators kicked in with a shudder that ran through the entire ICU, and the monitors resumed their steady beeping like resurrection itself. But Ashley had already saved him. Her hands moved with muscle memory that predated her nursing license by 14 years. The 14-gauge angiocath needle went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Just like Tikrit. Just like the solo surgery that had consumed 14 straight hours in a combat hospital with no attending, no backup, no option except to keep moving. The scalpel from the crash cart wasn't sterile, nothing about this was sterile, but infection was a problem for later. Exsanguination was a problem for now. She opened the left anterolateral thoracotomy with movements that had no hesitation in them, movements that belonged to a surgeon, not a floor nurse. The pericardium gave way. The heart was barely beating. One hand inside the chest cavity, one hand managing the suction, vital signs climbing on monitors that nobody was reading because everyone else in that room was standing frozen. The veteran's wound hadn't just hissed. The sutures had failed completely, and the internal bleeding was moving fast. Blood loss at this rate meant for minutes until cardiac arrest. Maybe 5 if the body was merciful. Ashley was the only attending present. The only qualified person within 100 feet. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask permission. She moved like someone who had already surrendered to consequence and decided consequence could wait. The hiss of air escaping the chest cavity. Blood on her forearms now, soaking through her scrubs like she'd been baptized in her own authority. Her fingers found the inferior vena cava and clamped it with a satin sky clamp, the same motion 1,000 times over, muscle memory made manifest. The monitors climbed. 68% oxygen saturation. 72, 78. Blood pressure stabilizing at 92/54. Not normal. Survivable. She didn't speak. She worked in the terrible beautiful silence of someone who had already made peace with losing everything. The attending cardiologist who finally appeared in the doorway stood frozen in the entrance like he'd hit an invisible wall. His name was Dr. Chen. He'd been downstairs when the power went out. He'd been trying to navigate the darkened stairwell like everyone else. When his eyes focused on what was happening in Bay 4, his expression underwent a transformation that Ashley caught peripherally, shock becoming comprehension becoming understanding that he was watching someone perform a miracle with the wrong credentials. Dr. Chen didn't stop her. He stood in the doorway and watched her save a man's life and said absolutely nothing. By the time the cardiologist had found his voice and stepped forward to take over, Ashley had already sutured and stepped back, her hand still steady as surgical steel. She'd handed off cleanly. Professionally. Like a surgeon handing off to another surgeon, not a nurse handing off to a doctor. 3 other nurses had witnessed the entire procedure: Maria, Derek, and a travel nurse named Cohen who'd only been at Seattle General for 6 weeks. 3 witnesses who understood exactly what they'd been watching. The veteran's blood pressure was 104/61 and climbing toward normal by the time Ashley left the bay. She'd walked to the supply room and stripped off her gloves. The blood had soaked through her scrubs completely. She'd need to change before the formal end of shift. She'd need to document. She'd need to be normal. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Mercer had seen it too. He'd appeared in the ICU hallway during the final moments of the surgery, called in by someone with the good sense to escalate when all attending physicians were unreachable. He'd stood in that doorway next to Dr. Chen and watched Ashley save a life with the precision of someone who had performed that exact procedure dozens of times. He'd watched her suture with hands that had no tremble in them. He'd watched her manage a thoracotomy in a power outage without a single mistake. And his face had turned the color of old bone. Within 2 hours, Dr. Mercer had mobilized every resource available to him. He was a man operating at stage 5 of his escalation, active sabotage, full commitment to her destruction, and he moved like someone who understood his window was closing. His first call was to Richard Bancroft, the hospital board's chair and the man who'd mentored Mercer through his entire tenure at Seattle General. Ashley watched from the hallway as Mercer gestured emphatically in the conference room, his voice rising and falling like he was performing an autopsy on her credibility. She couldn't hear the words, but she knew what they were. Dangerous. Unqualified. Exceeded her scope of practice. Threat to patient safety. All the language designed to make capital letters out of accusation. His second call was to HR, and that one he made loud enough for her to hear. Immediate suspension. Effective as of this shift. I want it documented that I formally requested she be removed from the premises before the end of business today. His voice had the quality of someone who'd already won, smooth and satisfied and utterly certain. His third action was the reassignments. He'd gone directly to the scheduling office and personally requested that Maria, Derek, and Cohen be moved to permanent night rotation, effective immediately. Better utilization of their skill sets, he'd told the scheduler, loud enough for others to hear. I'm trying to balance our overnight coverage. What he meant was, I'm separating them from her. I'm making sure they can't corroborate her story at any hearing. I'm poisoning the testimony before it can be given. By the time Ashley had finished stripping off her blood-stained scrubs in the locker room, security was waiting. 2 officers. Professional, apologetic, doing their job. The older one had the courtesy to meet her eyes as he extended the suspension letter. Ms. Cooper, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending formal investigation. Please surrender your badge and exit the building. She'd handed over the badge without a word. It had felt lighter than she expected, despite the weight of 3 years carrying it. 3 years being someone. 3 years of waking up at 5:27 a.m., 7 minutes before her alarm, and pulling on scrubs and becoming a person who mattered. The badge fit in her palm like it was made for surrendering. She'd maintained her composure walking through the main lobby. Eyes forward. Shoulders back. Not the posture of someone who'd been broken, but someone who'd chosen to break herself to keep the machinery intact. Other staff watched. Some knew what was happening. Some didn't, but they would, within hours. The rumor mill would churn, Ashley Cooper, suspended. Ashley Cooper, practicing medicine. Ashley Cooper, the nurse who'd overstepped. She'd made it to the glass doors of the main entrance before her body betrayed her. One tear. Just one, slipping down her cheek like something that had no permission to exist. She'd wiped it without breaking stride, without slowing, without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. The parking lot had been empty except for her car and the smell of hot asphalt under August sun. She'd sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes before starting the engine. She'd driven home on autopilot, muscle memory handling the roads while her mind remained in that ICU bay, in that moment when she'd made the choice to save someone and lose everything. The suspension letter had arrived by courier at 4:44 p.m. Heavy paper. Official letterhead. The language of betrayal dressed up in administrative formality. Gross misconduct. Unauthorized medical procedures. Practicing medicine without a license. Disciplinary hearing scheduled for 72 hours from date of notification. 72 hours. 3 days. The time it took for the world to collapse could be measured in hours if someone with authority decided to measure it that way. Ashley had been sitting at the kitchen table, staring at those words, when she heard Emma's backpack hit the floor. "Mommy? Why are you home?" Emma was 8 years old. She had her father's eyes, dark and serious, the kind of eyes that saw everything and missed nothing. She dropped her backpack by the kitchen entrance, still wearing her school uniform, still carrying the weight of a day that had been normal right up until the moment it wasn't. Ashley had tried to smile. The expression had broken on her face like something fragile. Emma had climbed into her lap, the way she did when Ashley was supposed to be at work, the way she did when the world was wrong in ways she couldn't articulate. "Why are you home?" Not curious. Afraid. Because Emma understood, in the way children understand, that her mother being home at 3:11 p.m. meant something had changed. Ashley had started crying then. Not the single tear, not the controlled breathing, not the composure that had held her together walking through the lobby. Real crying. The kind that came from the place where she'd buried 14 years of war and classified service and a name that wasn't supposed to be used anymore. Emma had pressed her small face against Ashley's shoulder and asked, over and over, in a voice that was breaking, "Why doesn't the hospital want Mommy anymore? Why don't they want you?" Ashley had held her daughter and couldn't answer. She couldn't explain that defending herself meant opening classified files. She couldn't explain that surfacing the truth about Tikrit would endanger everyone she'd served with, everyone she'd bled beside, everyone whose names were still officially redacted from every official record. She couldn't explain that a Pentagon officer had looked her in the eye, 3 months after the operation was classified and buried, and told her, "Captain Cooper, you're officially dead. Your service record is sealed. Your combat role doesn't exist. If you surface, if you make claims, if you try to claim any of this, you endanger the entire team. You stay silent, or you end careers. Do you understand?" She'd understood. She'd taken the silence like a discharge, like a final order, like a death of a kind that the living called survival. And now Dr. Mercer had engineered a situation where staying silent meant losing her career, and breaking silence meant breaking her oath to the people who trusted her with their lives. Emma had fallen asleep in her arms sometime around 7 p.m., her small body heavy with the weight of a confusion she couldn't process. Ashley had carried her to bed and tucked her under the quilt and returned to the kitchen table and the suspension letter and the 72 hours that stretched ahead like a countdown to something she couldn't control. She'd picked up her phone at 8:43 p.m. She'd held it without calling anyone, without texting, without reaching out to the 3 nurses who'd watched her work. They were on night rotation now. They couldn't help her. Nobody could help her. The machinery of institutional authority had engaged, and she was caught between 2 impossible loyalties, to silence, to survival, to the classified world that demanded she remain dead, or to truth, to consequence, to the daughter sleeping upstairs who deserved a mother who'd fought. The hospital board's disciplinary hearing convened at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, fluorescent lights casting everything in that sickly institutional green that made guilt look like a permanent condition. 7 board members sat behind a mahogany table, their expressions carved from disapproval. Dr. Mercer occupied a chair in the gallery, legs crossed, wearing a smile that looked like it had been tailored by someone who'd never experienced actual joy. Ashley sat alone at a smaller table facing them, her hands folded, her voice steady as they read the charges: reckless endangerment, practicing medicine without a license, gross violation of nursing protocols, insubordination. Each word landed like a hammer on a nail that was already driven deep. The board chairman, a woman named Richardson whose voice carried the weight of 30 years in administration, adjusted her glasses. Nurse Cooper, do you have anything to say before we recommend your permanent termination? The room held its breath. Ashley opened her mouth to respond when the doors at the back of the hearing room swung open. A wheelchair rolled through, pushed by a woman in her 30s, and behind them came a two-star general in dress uniform, his presence like a pressure change in the atmosphere. The room went dead silent. Every eye shifted. Even Mercer's smile faltered. The wheelchair-bound veteran was the patient from 4B. His name was Marcus Patterson. His hands trembled as they rolled him forward, and when he saw Ashley, something moved across his face like a door opening in a room that had been locked for years. His right hand, scarred and weathered, reached toward his jacket and found the lining. His fingers traced something there, a patch, faded green and gold, the emblem of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Reconnaissance Platoon sewn into the fabric with careful stitches. His eyes locked onto Ashley's, and his lips formed a single word, spoken so softly the room had to lean forward to hear it. Reaper. The name hung in the air like smoke. Ashley's composure didn't crack, but her hands tightened slightly on the table. Patterson's daughter stepped forward, holding a folder. Her voice shook as she began to read, Citation for Valor, Captain Ashley Cooper, United States Marine Corps, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Reconnaissance Platoon. For actions under fire in Tikrit, Iraq, July 15, 2009. Subject maintained a forward operating medical station for 14 consecutive hours during sustained enemy engagement. Performed 37 emergency surgical interventions under direct fire. 0 casualties among treated personnel. Directly prevented an estimated 41 combat deaths through field medicine expertise and tactical decision-making under extreme duress. She paused, swallowed hard. Silver Star. Captain Ashley Cooper. That's you. You're Captain Cooper. The general moved forward, his boots striking the tile in a rhythm that sounded like destiny announcing itself. He wore his medals like the man wore his authority, with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned every one. When he stood before Ashley, his right hand rose in a formal salute, held at perfect 90 degrees, the kind of salute rendered only to those who've bled for something larger than themselves. Behind him, 2 officers in crisp dress uniforms flanked him like sentries. The board members began to understand they were no longer in control of this room. Mercer stood abruptly. This is highly irregular. Protocols demand that any military service be disclosed during hiring. This woman misrepresented her qualifications, and the board has every right to. No. The general's voice cut through like a scalpel through silk. You have no right to anything, Doctor. Captain Cooper held a medical facility alone while you were probably perfecting your bedside manner in a teaching hospital. The complication you're accusing her of treating? That was caused by your surgical error during the patient's initial procedure. The one you buried in records. The one you've been burying for 16 years. The room temperature seemed to drop. Richardson's face went pale. An FBI agent stepped forward from the back of the hearing room, badge visible, and set 6 manila folders on the table in front of the board members. Dr. James Mercer. We need to speak with you about 83 patient files with post-surgical complications that were never reported. Medication errors reclassified as patient error. Mortality reviews that disappeared from official records. Another agent opened a folder, and there was the patient from 4B's original surgical intake sheet. This veteran's wound dehiscence didn't occur because of Nurse Cooper's actions. It occurred because you nicked the inferior epigastric artery during your initial closure and never reported it. When the infection spread, you altered the post-op notes to show he arrived with a pre-existing condition. She fixed what you broke and then buried the evidence. You broke what she saved. Mercer's face shifted through colors like a traffic light on overdrive, white to red to purple. This is a witch hunt. My credentials, my Johns Hopkins education, my surgical record. Your surgical record, the general interrupted, his voice dropping into that register that comes from giving orders that got men killed or saved, is a paper trail of mistakes and cover-ups. Captain Cooper has more combat surgical experience than most attending physicians will accumulate in a lifetime. She performed a field thoracotomy in darkness with a combat knife because your error made it necessary. And you tried to destroy her for it. Richardson pushed her chair back slowly, deliberately, the sound of it scraping across tile like fingernails on a chalkboard. She wouldn't meet Mercer's eyes. None of them would. One of the agents moved closer to Mercer. You're suspended immediately pending criminal investigation for medical fraud, falsifying records, and 3 counts of manslaughter in patients whose deaths resulted from your surgical negligence. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say. You can't do this, Mercer hissed, looking at Ashley like she was the architect of his collapse. You destroyed my career. You? No, Doctor. Ashley's voice, when she spoke for the first time since the hearing began, carried that quality of sound that comes from the bottom of a well, quiet, clear, absolute. You destroyed it yourself. I just kept saving the lives you endangered. The agents moved toward him, and his protests echoed down the corridor as they escorted him out, his voice getting smaller and smaller until it vanished entirely. The room exhaled. Patterson gripped Ashley's hand, and when she looked at him, recognition was complete in his eyes, not just the fragmented memory of a combat zone but the full understanding of who she was, who she'd been, what she'd done for him. Tears ran down his weathered face like rain on a windshield. You carried me out, he whispered. 3 miles. Through Fallujah. I remember now. You wouldn't leave me. His daughter embraced Ashley, her shoulders shaking. The general stood at attention, and when he spoke, it was the official voice of institution itself. Captain, your service is no longer classified. The Tikrit operation was declassified as of 0600 this morning. You're free. 6 months later, Ashley stood in the new rehabilitation wing at Seattle General in Savannah, reading the bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance, Cooper Center for Veteran Care, dedicated to those who served twice, once in uniform, once in healing. Through the window, her daughter Emma played in the courtyard with Patterson, teaching him to toss a football as his mobility improved week by week. His recovery had exceeded all projections. Memory restored. Physical therapy progressing like his body finally had permission to heal. The hospital had created a new position, Director of Veteran Services. They'd given it to Ashley without asking. She wore her uniform once a month now, visiting VA facilities across the Southeast, speaking about the transition from combat medicine to civilian nursing. The medals hung in a frame in her office, but the one that mattered most was the Silver Star, and seeing it validated after 16 years of silence felt like finally being able to breathe underwater. Through the loading dock window, she saw him. Mercer, wearing a polo shirt with a contractor's logo, loading boxes of medical supplies into a van. Medical license revoked. Surgical privileges permanently terminated. Career reduced to delivering bandages to rural clinics. When he looked up and caught her watching, he quickly looked away. Ashley felt no satisfaction, only the quiet recognition that consequences find everyone eventually. Pain was information, and this was the final diagnosis. Patterson joined her at the window, his gait improving, his strength returning. He studied the plaque with her name in bronze, then touched the tattoo on his arm. Cooper, still there, finally understood. You saved me twice, he said. Tikrit and here. That's what we do, Ashley replied simply. Emma burst through the doors, breathless with the kind of joy only children possess, and wrapped her arms around Ashley's waist. Mom, can we show Mr. Patterson your medals tonight? Patterson smiled, his hand finding Ashley's shoulder. I'd be honored, Captain. Ashley looked at the center that bore her name, at the veterans receiving care from staff she'd trained, at her daughter who finally understood why Mommy had been so sad but was proud now, so very proud. The weight she'd carried for 16 years had finally found its place, not on her shoulders but in the lives she'd touched, the people she'd saved, the truth that had finally emerged not through her defense but through its own unstoppable gravity. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and comment. Tell me about a time you or someone you know was underestimated and proved everyone wrong. And if you've served in any capacity, thank you. Your sacrifice matters, even when the world forgets to look.